Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this interview. This is the second interview with Jerry Drino, the Reverend Jerry Drino, who is talking with us about his journey through multiculturalism and questions about race, in particular in our diocese, but also in the larger church and the world in which we live. So the last time that we were together, Jerry talked about his journey as he brought us up into the early 1990s. And so, Jerry, today we're going to pick up at the 1990s, and I believe we were at the Rodney King riots.
Right. Okay.
So what was that like, Jerry? And what insights did you gain from that or learn as we were going through that time?
Well, I would say that the event so exploded into the life of the parish with all of the cultural diversity that it brought forth so many levels of what I would say the historic wounds and tragedies or traumas of the people. Certainly the Black community, but also the Native American community, the Hispanic, primarily Guatemalan and Filipino communities, but also the white communities, because the white members of the parish intentionally were at St. Philip's and chose to live on the east side of San Jose, which had always been the place where people of color were forced to live with redlining. So historically, it had always been a highly cultural diverse community. But the fact is that everyone, in a sense, understood their own marginalized and therefore precarious or vulnerable position. So that the day that we really responded to the Rodney King riots, and I think I described it in the first interview, it was a very cathartic moment for everyone. No one came thinking we were going to resolve anything, nor did we come thinking that this was some kind of healing service. It always bothers me when we have some event and immediately we want to jump into a healing response, which is really putting a Band-Aid on something that really, if it is a deep infection, it is far better that it be open to the air and the light and let it heal from within. And so I was, I was deeply moved by the whole community that it didn't cause rancor or uproar and conflict between each other, but if anything else, it showed us our common humanity and that we could mourn together and know that healing would probably eventually come down the road, but we didn't need to rush it. We needed to, as the Native Americans would say, to walk slowly with this experience and see what it is teaching us. And I'm not sure that that could have happened hadn't the slow evolution of the parish been going on for the last decade or so, if not longer, maybe the last 2 decades. It was a time of testing. Not that it came to test us, but we were ready for it, this intersection when it came.
And I think you talked a little bit before about your own your own learning during that time, that you were very aware of the fact that you were white, and that I believe one of the members of the parish was quite direct with you about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was one of the junior wardens. It had been when we were in the process of, we had a staff position open for an associate priest. And she came up to me and said, you know, Jerry, the congregation is very diverse. We are the Rainbow Coalition, or as one of the Guatemalan Afro-Caribbean women said, we are a bowl full of colors. However, Joan Fisher said, but up front, we are blinded by the light or the white, and that this is not a good message. Even though there are Eucharistic ministers that are representing all of the main cultural ethnic groups, it is still pretty white leadership. So with that, that is when I went to CDSP and was looking for a part-time priest, hoping to find someone who was going back to do postgraduate work. And the dean of students said, I think I've got the right candidate. And that was Sylvester Romero. And I explained to him, you know, I was looking for somebody who was either Hispanic, Native American, African American, or Asian. And he said, you got everything in me, because I am of Mayan descent. I grew up in a Black nation, Belize, and I've always identified myself as being Black, if anything else. But my mother had to take my sisters and myself to Guatemala because she couldn't find work. And so my adopted country was Guatemala, and I had to learn Spanish and learn the culture. And on top of it, my mother worked for a Chinese merchant and learned to cook Chinese food, and I love Chinese food. So you've got everything that is there.
What did you find in the larger church at that time in terms of what was going on and the way that the larger church was responding to the racial diversity and the cracks in our society that were being revealed? How was the larger church responding?
I can only speak for the province, which is Province 8, which is the Western United States, Hawaii, Alaska, and Taiwan. In the late 80s, no, the late 70s, actually, Bishop Gardner, the suffragan bishop of Los Angeles, had challenged the Provincial House of Bishops by saying, look at all the Southeast Asians, look at all of the Central Americans that are coming into our diocese, and we have no strategy whatsoever. And, yes, we could wait for a generation or so until, quote, they are real Americans, or we could step forward and develop a strategy. And I think we are unique in the whole American church, and that we could ask for money from the General Convention. So they put together a strategy, and the bishops, really understood that Province 8 is distinct because of its isolation and the great spaces between dioceses, unlike most of the other part of the American church. And so they worked on a strategy to memorialize the General Convention, did a lot of work on provincial synods, really created a compelling reason why a partnership, the only partnership that has ever been done between the General Convention and a province, was to create what was called the Hispanic Asian Pacific Island Ministry, HOPI MD, Ministry Development. And so in 1985, I think that was the General Convention, they went to General Convention and got $250,000 every year for 3 years, $750,000 that were the partnership, because they said, we are ready to take off with supporting inventive ministries. We want the resources, and we will be in partnership with matching funds from our diocese to see if we can establish new initiatives that we can all learn from. And that what we want to do is have some kind of institutional form where we have an executive director and a board of directors that includes one of the members of the House of Bishops, who will gather the learnings and then make them available to the rest of the diocese in the province. And so Sandra Bright, who was the wife of the then dean of St. Andrew's Cathedral in Honolulu, she became the first executive director. And Bishop Mallory, our own bishop, was one of the early bishops that convened the steering committee, or the HOPI Council. And he was succeeded, first as Bishop Gardner, then Bishop Mallory, and then Bishop Hart of Honolulu. Sandra Bright decided after 3 years that she wanted to retire with her husband. And so they started looking for a candidate. They were looking for someone who was both in the field, actually doing the work, and would be able to be part-time in the province and part-time continued her or his work there. And so there was about 5 candidates, and I was selected because St. Philip's at that point represented the most culturally diverse, intentionally ministry development parish in the province. And the vestry recognized that this was an opportunity for St. Philip's to be both a learning congregation as well as offer something to the larger church. And the whole concept of learning congregations was essential to HOPI MD, which once we brought in the Native American and African American networks, then we changed it to intercultural ministry development. We didn't call it multicultural because, or cross-cultural. Cross-cultural, it tends to be something that falls into the area of white privilege. White privilege cross over and go visit. You know, it's like going to a Mexican restaurant or
going to a museum rather than the engagement that you would want. Yeah.
And multicultural just says, okay, there's a lot of people from different cultural groups kind of together. It's kind of like the average neighborhoods, but there isn't any intentionality. Intercultural means that we retain our cultural identities, but we are growing and expanding because we are allowing each other's lives to impact us. In psychology, we call this entrainment. About 200 years ago, a Swiss or a Dutch clockmaker had all of his clocks on a wall, and he set the pendulum swinging at different rates. And eventually they would all swing together. And psychologically, that is entrainment. Over and over again, most of the ethnic groups that became a part of St. Philip's would eventually choose not to have separate services of worship, but they wanted to be one community. And that's why, and the model was at that point to have 5 junior wardens that I mentioned before, each representing one of those ethnic communities, so that we tried very hard not to be blinded by the white, and to rotate the senior wardens between the ethnic groups, as well as having parity with resources, with planning decisions, etc. That would be one of the models that we would take into the province. One of the key programs that we developed was a series of seminars with the title, "What Happens When Your Neighborhood Changes, but Your Congregation Doesn't?" And so we gathered people together to figure out what was going on in each of their congregations and what are the potentials. I remember going up to Idaho, and is it the Treasure Valley? What's the name of the valley?
That's the Boise area, is the Treasure Valley.
The Treasure Valley. And there was a coalition of parishes led by some grandmas that had started to all the young people had left the congregation, and the grandmas needed to be grandmas, and so they adopted a whole bunch of Latino kids to help with their school and just to be more support. And so they said, but there's a whole lot of diversity here in these 4 or 5 congregations, at least the communities. What are we going to do? And so I met with them and I said, well, who are the bridge people in your congregations?
Right.
Who are teachers? Who are social workers? Who are scout leaders? Who work with the police department, are social workers? Those people are already in those communities that you want your congregations to relate to. So instead of throwing your hands up and saying, we have absolutely no idea what to do, I said, oh yes, you do. You've got a whole lot of people with assets that are very competent and are growing in their competency in cross-cultural and multicultural, intercultural sensitivity and style. And so that became the basis of that whole initiative back in the 90s. I have no idea where it's gone from now, but
Well, that's what actually was going to be my question, is what happened with it. So I guess so that was started and put together on a more formalized level, right?
Right.
So as you were moving forward in your own personal exploration,
Right.
what happened next for you?
What happened for me is that in a real sense, I realized that I had grown past being a rector of a parish, and that this opportunity to do intercultural ministry did 2 things. One, it gave me an opportunity for the parish to mentor an associate, and the first one being Holly Hudson Lewis, to really take charge along with seminarians that would come to do their field education. And so the parish had an opportunity to bring in a new leadership, and that I could be there as a mentor. But in fact, my focus was to the larger picture. In terms of the national church, as recognition of what was going on, I realized that my real vocation is more as a mentor and as a teacher. And they asked me to first write research and write a curriculum on cultural sensitivity in the ordination process, because the then Department of Ministry Development that included all the seminaries, they had no resources, and they said Province 8 is the place where this is happening, and so we want you to write this resource. Eventually, working with a coalition of archdeacons and missioners that had the responsibility for quote ethnic ministries in their diocese, we developed additional resources and courses to help with that cultural sensitivity. My own personal vocation saw a deepening investigation into what I would say the inner work of trying to make sense of what the gospel is about from a personal level that isn't based on traditional Christianity, but on a deeper understanding of the patterns that Jesus was talking about in the Synoptic Gospels. And so at the same time in all of this, I was first in training and then an associate leader of the Guild for Psychological Studies, which is two of the Jungian groups or institutions in the Bay Area. And when we approached the turn of the century, the Hispanic Network had challenged the House of Bishops, the Provincial House of Bishops, to stop bringing former Roman Catholic Latinx priests into the diocese and making them the pastors of their congregations, because these clergy were still Roman Catholic clergy, just married and now with Episcopal papers. And they were, for the most part, disasters because they were very autocratic. They did not understand American processes and processing and kind of an egalitarian way of being church, which had drawn the Latinx people to those congregations. And so together, the next challenge was to say, we've got to really look at the ordination process. The province has 90, at that point, they had 98 different ethnic communities, not individual congregations. There were over 300 of those, but different ethnicities. And only about 10 of those had ordained persons. And so we said, what is our problem there? The Hispanic Network is saying that the problem is that we are not training people who have a vocation out of these communities, and we are caught in an academic mindset that is really white elitism. It's academic elitism. And then even those who may have a bachelor's degree that could go to seminary, by the time they're out of seminary, they're educated out of their culture, and they are not fit to go back. And so many clergy that do have seminary degrees have chosen not to return to their own communities because they have, for whatever reason, experienced a different, I don't know necessarily broader, but a different cultural milieu that they feel more comfortable in. Plus, it's more rewarding.
Mhm.
That it really gets down to the bottom line. Where's the money? I remember one diocese that had several Vietnamese ministries, and they had 3 clergy in the ordination process. One was ordained. They knew the other 2 were coming along, but they stopped a strategy that would have provided for a position for these other 2 Vietnamese seminarians. And so when the second seminarian came out, he was the brother of the first ordained priest, and there was no place for him. So the older brother resigned his position and went to work for an international NGO that worked primarily in Africa, so that his brother could have the position. And I remember having long conversations with this bishop, very liberal bishop, and long-sided. But basically, the diocese had gone through its ethnic ministry phase of about 10 years, and they didn't want to put any more resources into it. So even though the field was and the harvest was plentiful, there were no workers because the church hadn't provided for them.
Mhm.
So the next resource that took 6 years to research and write, because the more and more I got into it, the more and more you looked at the systemic problems. And that was meeting on new ground,
Mhm.
cultural diversity in the ordination process. And it was one of the leaders of the Hispanic community that had challenged the House of Bishops, who said, the church as it exists now is not going to ever be really open to all of us. A few of us might get in if we know how to play the game and know how to behave right, and we are proper, but the vision has got to be that all of us have to meet in a new place. The old form is just not going to happen. And so that was the title, Meeting on New Ground. So the challenge was, if dioceses are really going to acknowledge that we need vocations to ordain ministry from persons that are moved in different communities, and that we acknowledge that, yes, this is a call from God, and that we want that, then that the church needs to be in a place where they're willing to change and to, in some cases, start over. And of course, as we look at all of the floundering congregations we have, not only in our diocese, 15 years ago, the church pension fund said that 2/3 of all Episcopal congregations are financially unviable. That was 15 years ago.
Mhm.
So here's this great opportunity to start over again, but with a gathered community that reflects the community of diversity that is gathered in every region. And we discovered that the archdeacons and missioners, because they were the ones that were really on the front line in working with these congregations, they said, we know that there are congregations that are willing that would rather die than change.
Mhm.
And there's
That's right.
absolutely nothing we can do about it. So we just let them wind down, and the last one standing turn off the lights and lock the door. That's.
During this time, as you were kind of going through all of this, did you notice any particular influence coming out of Province 9 that informed any of the work that you were doing, or that made you curious, or anything like that that emerged from that province, from Province 9?
Well, Sylvester Romero became Bishop of Guatemala, or Bishop of Belize,
Yeah.
in 1993, I believe. And he had me come down there several times. And because he had been a key leader in Guatemala, he often had Guatemalan priests, over into Belize. And so I had an opportunity to speak with them and priests from Honduras. And at that point, Honduras was in quite a few partnerships with the American Diocese, which brought, significant resources to where they were. One of the interesting conflicts in Province 9 that was reflected in Province 8, at least, was the Afro-Caribbean Hispanic communities, which were feeling very much on the outside. Even though several of the Central American dioceses had really been born out of Anglicans coming from the West Indian Isles.
Belize in particular, certainly.
Belize, but parts of El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, Costa Rica. They're so. I remember a conference in LA with a national Black and Hispanic joint conference, and it was painful and very volatile in terms of what was emerging there.
Can you say more about that, the nature of that, and why was it so painful, and what was the volatility arising from?
It ultimately was the same racism that we are facing here. That people of African descent feeling that they were looked down upon. And if you look at the racism in Latin America, especially against the indigenous people, the preference of Spanish people that can claim Spanish blood and have the white face. All you have to do is turn on most Spanish-speaking television programs, and you see the same prejudice coming. And so that was all being lived out in Spanish.
Sure.
And that yet a good third, at least in Province 9, of the members were of African descent. And others. I remember one bishop who, when he was a priest, had been at St. Philip's for a while and was exposed to our Native American ministry. And he began to really meet indigenous Native American people as human beings. And he said it never dawned on him. He'd always looked down at the indigenous. And even though he was indigenous, you just look at him, you know that he's part Mayan. He would never identify with that. And he said, it then dawned on me that in my own house, there was an old lady that was always there. And I didn't know who she was. That was his grandmother. And
oh, interesting.
And he, the degree of internalized racism was so immense. And so, of course, during that time, Province 8 was in the process of trying to form their own autonomy. And there were a lot of fine priests, Episcopal priests, that were coming into Province 8 from Province 9 that were not the Roman Catholics. And they understood completely. In fact, they were the most vocal when they saw, former, heads of seminary and cardinal rectors of Roman Catholic parishes come in and then assume that they would be in the same position in the Episcopal Church at a very high level and position. So it was very interesting. The whole question of indigenous ministry, the National Church's leader of Native ministry at that point, she wanted nothing to do with indigenous people south of the border. And so when the Hispanic Network, who said, yeah, half of us are indigenous, we do not want to even use the term Hispanic because Spain has nothing to do with who we are and our identity. And yet you won't let us indigenous people be a part of the American indigenous ministry. And so it was just very complicated negotiating going on back and forth. And oftentimes, Province 8 was where the National Church's staff, ethnic staff, could come and talk with a freedom that they didn't have at the National Church level. And of course, that was during Bishop Browning's time with all the upheavals that were going on at the National Church. And there was this rigid control of holding everything close to the breast. And so Province 8 was this liberal place where people could really kind of talk things out.
I always thought that it was really interesting when we would talk about, for example, something like the Virgin de Guadalupe, right? La Guadalupana, because it was very interesting to, I saw that as being at the center of some of the tension that I would see between indigenous populations and Latino populations, because it was who gets to claim the Virgen de Guadalupe.
Right.
And that was a very interesting discussion that I encountered on that, because it was about, we own her, she's ours, no, she's ours. I wondered why it had to be that way, right? Where she couldn't be everybody's. Well, eventually, in many ways, she is everybody's, as a good Marian figure would be, right? But it was a very interesting point of tension. Did you experience that here as well?
Yes. I mean, the sad thing is that who she is as a sacred reality is one of several manifestations of the sacred feminine. Right. That is indigenous to the Americans. I mean, I think white buffalo calf woman for the Lakota people is a similar experience. When I read Virgilio Elizondo's book, and it's just so powerful. And the sad thing for people who do not have that indigenous Latinx background, it's incomprehensible to them why she is so significant. It's like, oh, are you talking about Cinco de Mayo, or are you talking, I mean, what is this all about? And it's like, it become, she has been held in a very tight container, and has not had what people have not been open to allowing the impact of what she represents as the convergence of indigenous and European culture and spirituality, but an indigenous spirituality that emerges out of the land, that for non-indigenous, non-Latinx people, it's a missed opportunity, and yet she is there. I mean, I always, the fascinating thing about the power of who she is, and I remember when I was invited back to St. Philip's and to talk to the Hispanic congregation on the Feast of the Guadalupe, and I said, the reason this parish is multicultural is because of Guadalupe. She was the one that did this. And I said, when I was in Tijuana in the 80s, I had my favorite walking tour through all these great shops, a 2-hour walking tour I would take people on. And she found me in a little shop in the back alley, and it was a black statue about 3 feet tall. And she said, "I want you to take me home." So I took her home, and I put her on the back altar in the church, and she was just there, kind of presiding and observing. It would take, I would say, 6 to 8 years before Sylvester Romero came and the emergence of a Spanish-speaking congregation. But of course, they were all Guadalupe, Guatemalan, and of course, their Black manifestation is the escapulas.
Right.
And so when the Bishop of Guatemala came to visit, first of all, he was blown away by all the statues, that were in the church, and Guadalupe, and we had a big Guadalupe banner and everything. And I told him, I said, well, she's the one that you're here. She's the one that brought people here. Now, telling this story is incomprehensible to most of the clergy and most of the congregations that are not related to that kind of indigenous symbology that is there. And yet, it's the challenge that El Camino Real has is that, yes, it has a Spanish name, but I don't think it's ever really related to the Spanish heritage that stands behind it, the indigenous heritage, the Californio heritage. When Father Sarah was canonized a saint, I proposed in the diocese that we do have some kind of dialogue about the significance of this. Now, most of the leadership came from outside of California, and therefore were not introduced to Father Sarah and the California missions in the 3rd grade as the standard part of curriculum. But to those of us that are indigenous, his symbol, with all of the problems about genocide, about abuse of Native people, it still is a very powerful symbol. I couldn't get anybody in the diocese to even want to enter into dialogue about that. So I said, okay, I'm going to go to one of my favorite missions, San Antonio de Padua. And I called up and I said, can I make a private retreat? And they said, nobody's going to be around. You can have the whole place. And so I went down there and stayed for 3 days all by myself. I mean, there was somebody that would come during the day to work in the gift shop, but I just lived with all the spirits of the Esalen people, the Selenian people, all of the padres that had come through, including it was one of Father Sarah's favorite missions, and so he and I and they and we all had long conversations together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if anybody who in the diocese has any need to relate to the roots of why we're El Camino Real and the 5 missions that are a part of what we call the King's Highway. You know, I mean, the fact is that when people look at the website, they still talk about real Episcopalians. And it just drives me up the wall. No, real Episcopalians, not real Episcopalians, but it's like anglicizing everything.
There is that tendency, and I was wondering when you were talking about the Virgin Guadalupe, and of course in other places we have Juquila, right? Who is the other virgin that is prevalent in some of our Latino congregations. Is how do you find in our body, in the larger church body, not just in our diocese, but in the larger church, that the predominantly white culture, the predominantly white anglicized Church of England type culture relates to the presence of the Juquila and the Guadalupana? How do they, or what have you encountered with that in your work?
I think at the surface level, it's a curiosity.
Okay.
But at a deeper level, it's an irritation, because these images of the Virgin relate to the fact that there is a spirituality that was here long before the arrival of Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
And that the incarnation had been going on for 10, 15,000 years. And the fact is that Europeans did not come with any missionary zeal. They were driven by power and greed.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the Jamestown Covenant has very specific agreements with the Powhatan Confederation, they were never fulfilled. And it's kind of like all of the so many of the treaties with the various nations were never fulfilled. So I think what is happening with say Black Lives Matter,
yeah,
and that the fact is that the wave of protests, which could be very explosive this week if the verdict comes to dismiss Chauvin,
mm-hmm.
Back in Minneapolis, that we're having to really wrestle with what does it mean to be American, and for the church, what does it mean to be the American church? I remember in working with Bishop Stephen Plummer, the first Navajo bishop, and at one point he said, I think there is an Episcopal church with Navajo in it, but I'm not sure the church is Navajo.
Mhm.
And I would say, I think there is an American church, but I wonder if it really is American in what America is today. We see all of the white entitlement reactions and the whole pull to make America great again, which means to make it white again.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I mean, I guess at a personal level, what I find myself continually readjusting to is those images of the church and those images of America that I grew up with and I loved deeply. I mean, I felt I was at times back from the 14th century in England. In fact, one of my majors in college was medieval English history. But I realized that those images no longer are generative. They no longer give life,
Mhm.
and that there are other images, and the Guadalupe is one of them. Certainly, my 23 years of working with the Navajo and the sacred chantways, their mythologies and spiritualities are deep within who I am, and root me to the indigenous spirituality. So I think for white Episcopalians, those who have eyes to see and ears to hear know that there is a change going on that requires us to acknowledge our white privilege and to really work through that and release it in order for us to, again, come to common ground. And that what I appreciate with when you have a critical mass of people, and I think we're moving towards a critical mass in this diocese of people of Spanish-speaking or Latinx congregations. We're not there yet, but when you have a critical mass, then people do not feel they have to have permission to be there. They know that they belong. I remember one Guatemalan leader who had gone to many congregations in Santa Clara County trying to find a home. And when Sylvester came and he arrived with 36 Guatemalans that just knew he was going to start services there. I remember about a year later, this man, we were in an annual meeting and we were talking about what is really important to us. And he stood up and he said, for the first time, I know that I am home. This is the first time since leaving Guatemala that I feel that I am a part of a church community, not because I'm an oddity, because that's the way I've always felt in the other congregations, but because you see me for who I am, and I don't have to say, oh, there's the Guatemalan over there. I am who I am because I'm a part of this diversity that's there.
There's an interesting piece of that too, just thinking about, we know, and you would know this from your work with psychology, that people, what feeds people spiritually in terms of the language that they choose to worship in is that they go to the language that they were worshiping in during their formative years.
Right.
And that's where they find their spiritual grounding. And so it's, I wonder if the person you're speaking of, having that opportunity to worship in a language formed by being Guatemalan, by being from Guatemala, would have brought him home,
Right.
spiritually found a place for that.
Mm-hmm. And that there were people who looked like him.
Yeah.
And, because each language carries a different spirituality and that is not easily translated into another language. And, my grandson is taking Hawaiian. He's part native Hawaiian in Honolulu. And I was asking him about some words, and he said, my teacher said, there are some words that have no meaning.
Right.
They are just to link
Mm-hmm.
other words or stories together. And that is so incomprehensible to European language that is very precise, very utilitarian. It is what it is, and sequential and everything. And like many native languages, the majority of the words are verbs, not
Mm-hmm.
nouns.
Mm-hmm.
And how to live in a church with verbs instead of nouns is, a paradigm to consider. And
brings a different challenge, doesn't it?
And I think COVID-19 has given us a taste of what that might be.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just coming back from Hawaii, one of the state senators was bemoaning the fact that now that they're opening up to tourists again, he says, I don't know if we've learned anything. That being a one industry culture is disastrous, because we're so dependent upon the tourism that the average tourist does not respect the culture, does not respect the environment. It's just a larger Disneyland that that is driven by consumerism. And he said, we said we were going to really learn, but I'm not sure we have. And so the change, and so in the diocese, it's like, what are we learning? How are we living with verbs instead of nouns?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. Because when we talk about, the being new church,
right,
being new church is a church of verbs. Because the church that we are is a church that, not always, but in many cases, is the church of building, right?
mm-hmm.
Which is the noun. That is the key noun.
Yeah.
And so when you say that, I marvel at that. I want to go back to just another thing that I was thinking about in terms of when you look at Black Lives Matter, our most recent way of looking at this, but take us back to that comparison with Rodney King. Do you see, have we made any progress as a society? Have we made any progress as a church? Where are we stuck?
I think back in Rodney King, and then, in my own experience, the Watts riots.
Yeah.
Back in '65, but for Blacks, I mean, from the beginning, none of this is a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
But what may be different now is that because Black Lives Matter has sustained its presence across the country, and then we have to say around the world, it has touched a similar thing. There is an opportunity for us to take ownership of what our past is, that includes coming from a place of slave owners, of murderers, of rapists, but also of saints and scientists and humanitarians. We're all that mix. And to really understand what Jesus said, it's not what goes into you that corrupts you, that defiles you, but what comes out of you.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to know what is inside of us. And like I said, I think last time, early on in the cultural diversity, when it was primarily the Laotian community that was there, and people were starting to drop away from the church. One of them said, I don't come to church to learn that I'm a racist. Well, they weren't learning that they were racist. They were confronted by their own racism, and it was coming from within them. I wasn't preaching sermons on racism, but they came very uncomfortable or became uncomfortable. So I think
were the Laotians uncomfortable?
No, the whites. The whites
white
were
people.
uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it will, when Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, pick up your cross and follow me daily. He did not say, work through your cross and get rid of it, get clean of your cross. And he certainly didn't say, pick up my cross.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we put a cross around our neck, we have to be very careful, because we may be trying to believe that Jesus has saved us from our sins, that he has relieved us of our own cross, when in fact he never said that. He never said that. So the difference may be that there are more people committed to letting go of an idealism about what the church is and what America is, and accept what it is, and says, this is the raw material that we have to work with. And it is fantastic. The diversity that is there. We have new neighbors who are Muslims from India, and it's just, it's just fantastic. When they break their fasts now in Ramadan, oftentimes they'll call up and say, come to the back fence, we've got some food left over we want to share with you. So we're breaking the fast with them several times a week. It just, and then the other neighbor is Buddhist, and across the street we've got two Black families, and down the street two Vietnamese families. So it's we're exactly where at least my wife and I feel we should be. And when you look at the formation of the early community of the followers of Jesus, again, it was all verbs. It was all verbs.
That's right.
There was, and it was called the church, the ecclesia. The ecclesia was the assembly of those, and go, and how do we loosen up? And I remember working with First Nations seminarians up at Vancouver School of Theology, and maybe I mentioned this, and they were bemoaning the terrible trauma of residential schools that they had personally experienced, and their families had experienced, and that they felt that the culture had been wiped away. And at one point I said, no, it's like a tree that has been cut down, and it appears that it's been wiped away. But just watch. If those roots want to live, they will begin to throw up another shoot, another tree, because the potential is in the root. And what I tried to say to people, whites at St. Philip's, when we were changing the liturgy, where no longer were the Easter and Christmas celebrations the way that they had always seen them, right out of very old England. I said, trust that the roots of that liturgy are still within us, but they're going to come out another way. Mm-hmm. And those that hung in there, they came to appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Others, no, they confuse the outer form with the inner form. Mm-hmm. And so, the great experiment going forward for America and for the church, and there's no guarantee, is will there be enough people who really are in touch with the inner form of both the church and the nation to watch where the new life is going to emerge, that racism and genocide point to the fact that the dream, or to use Jungian terms, the archetype, was derailed, that it was distorted, and that we need to, one, acknowledge that, and then to realize that that deeper pattern, which Jesus would call the kingdom of God, which is a verb. It is the reigning of God. And of course, all the words for God in Hebrew are verbs. So, we're heavy into verbs, that this is the nature. So it's congregations do have the choice. Are we going to die? Or are we going to reinvent ourselves? But not reinvent ourselves by just trying to reconstitute who we were, but let that which is deep within us, namely the kingdom of God,
the reign of God,
the reign of God, to determine what is needed for this time and place, and what will emerge, and how free are we to do that embracing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This, Jerry, this has been a great couple of interviews. Your experience is so vast. Your learnings are remarkable. Your understanding of the church and your experiences with it. I have a question, though, just one last question.
Okay.
So, here we talk about this, and we talk about, watching the church and the ways that it's missed the boat. Mm-hmm. And all the work that you've done and repeated and tried in different ways through different angles, and times in which, the church has reached out to Jerry Drino and said, come show us, come teach us, come help us figure this out. But there have been a lot of times where that wasn't the case. What made you hang in there?
Good question. I think it had to go back probably to my original sense of calling to be priest. I can't remember if I've mentioned this when I was on the Uinta Ore reservation in Utah. Mm-hmm. And, in a sense, something deep in my soul moved that was related to the land. Our Lady of Guadalupe would understand this, mm-hmm. but it was Ute, the sacredness of the land. It was the sacredness of the land that was my calling. And that I remember going back 20 years later and preaching at this little mission church, and I said, none of you realize that I am your grandson, but let me tell you what got started here, and I am related to you, and my spiritual roots are in this place. And they were kind of blown away by that. But I realized that there was a core experience that was my call, and that it was to stay related to the church, but not expect the church to authenticate who I was. There were times that I have railed against the church, and I've alienated many bishops over the years. But I also have a deep sense that God wanted me to be where I am at any given point, and that the calling was not because the church has set me aside to do that. I appreciated when the church chose to use me who I am, but I was not expecting that the church would validate who I was and what my ministry was. And in fact, there were points in which I realized that I am far beyond where most of the church is. And therefore, it's very lonely. And I rejoice when I find people that ask questions like you're asking, because they are in a similar place. And there is a kind of conspiracy. I love that term because it means we're breathing together. We're breathing together.
Conspirare, right?
Yeah, and and I found that all over the world. And therefore, what keeps me related is that I know that there is something deep that is very much alive and is trying to be manifested, incarnated in some way, and it's constantly a surprise. And it's because I guess of looking at the religious way that Jesus taught in the parables of the Synoptic Gospels, not the religion about Jesus, which is Christianity, but the religious way, which I love the term. The two root words for religion in Latin are religare and religere. Religare means to be in touch with something ancient that you've lost touch with, but religere means to observe carefully. And so my religious experience among the Ute was I became connected to the sacred in the land, but then I began to observe carefully where that connection was leading me. My ordination, oftentimes the ordained priest, the bishop asks you to give the first blessing, afterwards, and with the clergy. And I wasn't expected, I didn't know that was going to happen. And so when he asked me, I said, this is just after the Watts riots. And I said, in no way am I going to pull out the Book of Common Prayer and read a blessing from there. I'm going to let this moment form a blessing, which I did. He was very conservative. I could tell that he was just, fit to be tied, that how had I just ordained this person, and now he's not even using the Book of Common Prayer. And the other clergy, they just didn't know what to do. But I think it is living with the authority that is in the moment, and what the land is calling, what the society is calling. And sometimes the institution, people in the institution of church can see that, and sometimes they can't.
Right.
And when I stopped being angry at the church for not being able to see, and there's no guarantee that I won't get angry again, tomorrow. That letting people where they are, and those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, then I mean, Jesus didn't have a big success rating, in his own time, and who knows, where it will lead. Where it will lead.
Thank you, Jerry. This has been a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and I really do deeply appreciate this. It's very affirming. So thank you.
Thank you.